All right, so everybody's interested in how communities will respond to global warming, and there's been a lot of attention given to the shifting ranges of populations. What did I do? There we go. Okay, that doesn't work. But we all know that Earth doesn't look like this. Populations are fragmented because of fragmented landscapes and barriers to dispersal. The epitome of this is freshwater systems, either naturally for lakes and ponds or anthropogenically due to damming. And so the problem for freshwater populations and communities is they'll experience the full brunt of any warming or any physicochemical changes associated with climate change. So they'll have to adapt in place to persist in those environments. And the way most people have studied the effect of changing climate on communities is to take ecologically similar communities and then heat one up or apply some other climate stressor over short time periods to see what happens. But this doesn't take into account the potential for adaptive evolution to occur over very short timescales and how that might mediate community responses to warming. And so today I ask, one of the central questions of my dissertation is, what is the role of evolution in mediating responses to increased temperature? And here I focus on predator evolution. That's because I like fish, but it's also because adaptation at the highest trophic level is known to kind of cascade through communities and to shape community structure. The species that I've been focusing on is western mosquito fish. It's a non-native here. It's known to rapidly adapt to novel environmental conditions, and it also has very strong top-down effects, particularly in the pelagic zone of ponds through predation on zooplankton. And the populations that I've been working on in this chapter of my dissertation are a series of geothermal springs in the Mammoth Lakes and Bishop area. I'm sure many of you have been to. And as I said, mosquito fish were introduced to California fairly recently. So any differences that occur among these sites have arisen fairly rapidly in less than 100 years. Each of these sites is a dammed spring, and so humans have dammed them for various purposes, but what that does is it allows the mosquito fish populations inhabiting these springs to potentially adapt very precisely to the local thermal conditions. These springs are all located very close together, so they have the same regional species pool, and they're all qualitatively very similar, and they're also physicochemically very similar other than temperature. So you might reasonably expect that any trait differences among mosquito fish in these different populations are due to temperature. So using this system, today I'll ask two sub-questions. One is an evolutionary question: how do fish adapt to the increased temperature along this cool temperature gradient? And then an eco-evolutionary question: how does that fish adaptation mediate community responses to warming? And I just wanted to point out again that I'm using the word adaptation in the strict sense as evolutionary biologists would, so adaptive evolution. And the method that I use to isolate the genetic contribution to the trait differences among population is common garden rearing. And so what you basically do is take fish from some of these populations, you bring them into a common lab environment for 2 generations to wipe away direct effects of environment on traits, and that just leaves only genetic contributions to the trait differences between populations, indicating recent evolutionary divergence. So the first question, how do fish adapt to increased temperature along this gradient? I focus on growth and body size, both because temperature is known to impact these traits and they're ecologically relevant. And so far I've done most of this work just with 2 populations. I'll refer to them as a cool source and a warm source fish. And to address this first question, I also common reared the fish at 3 temperatures. So what happens with growth? So I'll just point out first that the blue line is the cool source population, the red line is the warm source population, and because these are second generation common fish, any difference between the line is due to evolution. So warm source fish here have evolved relatively slower growth at each of the rearing temperatures. And we don't really see a shift in the shape of this thermal performance curve due to adaptive evolution, just the height of it, which is interesting. Moreover, if you look at the cool source population, so the green circle on the left, at its home temperature, 23 Celsius, it grows at the same rate as the warm, so the warm source fish have evolved to decrease their growth rate such that it's offset the direct environmental effects of rearing temperature. So if you were to go into the field and look at the growth rates of these fish, they might look similar, but really there is potential for a lot of adaptive evolution that's stabilizing those traits. And if we look at length at maturity, we see that at each of the 3 rearing temperatures, every single one of the warm source fish that I reared was smaller than the cool source fish. And we also don't see much temperature dependence of length of maturity, or rearing temperature dependence of length of maturity, although some more data would be great. And so this, to tie this back to the other populations, this seems to indicate that the pattern that I see in the field of kind of a strong decline in size at maturity is perhaps driven mostly by evolution and not plasticity. So how did fish adapt to the increased temperature along this gradient? They appear to slow their growth and decrease their size at maturity. Moving on to the next question, does fish adaptation mediate community responses to warming? And for this part of the talk, I just used fish commandeered at the intermediate temperature from the first part at 27 Celsius. And so I took these fish and then I asked, do they diverge in their effects on communities? The way I did that was with a mesocosm experiment at UC Santa Cruz. I set up these experimental ponds, created populations of 10 individuals from either the warm source fish or the cool source fish, and then took a rich zooplankton, phytoplankton community from nearby ponds and inoculated all of them. And then I crossed this fish population source treatment with 2 temperatures, so either an unwarmed or a warm treatment, just using a simple aquarium heater, and that's what the average temperature treatments look like over time. And so it was a 1-month experiment, and I tracked the zooplankton community weekly over that 1-month period. So first, looking at crustacean zooplankton biomass, and then on the x-axis is weeks since fish introduction. So crustacean zooplankton are a preferred prey of mosquito fish. We see that the warm source fish cause a relatively greater reduction in the biomass of their preferred prey. And so now moving from the unwarmed panel to the warmed panel, we see that this thermal adaptation the effect looks the same at both unwarmed and warm temperatures. So warming causes a decline in the biomass of crustaceans, and this is additive with fish or predator thermal adaptation. So why might this be happening? I performed this experiment twice, and I actually euthanized the fish at that first week and then looked at their diet contents, and I think what's going on is the warm source fish have evolved a preference for relatively smaller size zooplankton. So in essence, they can still eat the large size zooplankton, but they prefer small size zooplankton, so they can greater suppress the total biomass of crustaceans. And that's shown on this graph on the left. So on the x-axis is the available cladocerans, and each point is a population. On the y is the cladoceran size in the guts. And you really see that the warm source fish are eating the same size regardless of what's available. And the cool source fish are eating relatively larger size zooplankton, except in that one case where there wasn't anything else available. What about community composition? So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the fact that crustaceans probably outcompete rotifers much of the time. So when mosquito fish consume a lot of crustacean zooplankton, that releases rotifers from competition. So if we plot the proportion of the zooplankton community that were rotifers, which are relatively small-bodied and are not consumed by mosquito fish, we see the flip of the graph that I showed before. So thermal adaptation and warming are both additively causing a shift towards dominance by smaller zooplankton taxa, rotifers. So we also, to sum this up, we also found that in addition to the evolution of slower growth and decreased size and maturity of mosquito fish at higher temperatures, they seem to consume smaller prey, and this fish adaptation exacerbated the warming-induced reduction of large consumer taxa and community shifts towards small taxa. Moreover, if you calculate just a simple effect size metric, G, we see that for both crustacean zooplankton biomass and proportion rotifers, that the effect of predator adaptation in this short-term experiment was about the same size as for warming. So to conclude, if we're going to study this data suggests that if we're going to study community responses to warming, we might need to account for adaptation, especially in the ecologically important trophic levels or ecologically important species to accurately predict outcomes. And I wanted just to acknowledge a bunch of people, but also Cal SFS for supporting my travel here today. Thank you. Maybe one quick question before break.
Just wondering, were the mosquito fish and the communities within those small ponds, it looked like, were they introduced around the same time historically?
The community was given about 3 weeks before the mosquito fish were introduced, so they could reach some kind of baseline.
No, I mean, where did you come from originally?
Oh, so did you ask where the zooplankton?
So like in the Mammoth Lakes area, where those lakes were, where those ponds were,
yes. Mm-hmm.
The mosquito fish, were those introduced around the same time?
Yeah, so we don't know their precise evolutionary history and introduction history, but I guess to give a more precise estimate than sometime after 1923, we know that the mosquito vector control district out there was worried about bottlenecking in these small populations, so they were actually moving fish around up until about the 1990s. So we don't know the pathway, but we know that there was mixing, and we can't nail down the...
Do you have a sense for maybe like how many generations each of those ponds got acclimated to those different temperature profiles, I guess is what I'm getting at?
Sure, yeah. So I think a maximum of up to 1,000 generations if they were in fact introduced 100 years ago, because mosquito fish at hot temperatures can reproduce really quickly, but potentially very few, less than 100 too. So.